Lord of the Mysteries audiobook by Kevin 530, one great acting he has some things to ask Captain. Danitz frowned as he watched J.M. and Sparrow leave the room, unsure what his real motive was. What is this fellow really after? Money, riches. But he had the time to take away the heads of Steele Moretti and Blood Brambles Hendry to exchange for nearly £10,000 in bounty rewards. Yes, even after paying any commissions, it would still be £7,000 to £8,000. Yet he didn't do so. Moreover, he generously shared the spoils of war with me. This is very contradictory. When he first heard that I was blazing, his first reaction was to call me a £3,000 bounty. In Captain's words, this isn't scientific. Why would he deliberately give up the bounty? Unless he has a better way to claim it safely, or he had specially left it for someone. Yes, he had been prepared for the appearance of the mandated punishers. He has his own connections and information channels. This way, everything can be explained. There's also the possible existence of the demigod that killed Kalangos. There's a powerful and secretive organization behind J.M. and Sparrow. Shocked by his own conjecture, Danitz instinctively tried to use his body language to express his feelings, but he forgot that his left arm was still fractured. He immediately grimaced in pain. This made him feel even more terrified. He didn't want his captain to meet such a dangerous and crazy fellow. He even suspected that J.M. and Sparrow's real motive was his captain's £26,000 bounty. In a duel, that lunatic might not necessarily win against Captain, and there's still the first mate, second mate, third mate, and a few bosuns. But he has a terrifying organization backing him. You want to hurt Captain? Over my dead body. Danitz puffed out his chest, raised his neck, and was filled with a stirring sense of self-sacrifice. He ran a hand through his hair, gave a long grunt, and said to himself, I'll make further observations. Perhaps J.M. and Sparrow really only has questions that he wants answered. Subconsciously, he looked around and found both the flying carpet and the shadow cloak. They weren't missing. In other words, J.M. and Sparrow left the things that belong to me behind. Isn't he afraid that I'll take the opportunity to escape? Or did he steal my hair that makes it easy for divination? No, he's a crazy guy. Even if he wishes to use my hair, he would just walk over and extend his hand to pull one out. It's impossible for him to do it secretly. Right, there's a powerful and secretive organization behind him. Perhaps at this moment there are people from that organization secretly monitoring me. They're waiting for me to leave, waiting for me to seek out Captain. How insidious. J.M. and Sparrow must have gone out on purpose. Danitz felt that he had grasped the truth of the matter thanks to his experience and wisdom. He paced back and forth before sitting back in the reclining chair. He then thought with a silent, mocking smile, I'm not leaving. I want to see what you can do. I will not bring danger to Captain. 3:15 in the afternoon, Simim Island. This island was also a part of the Rorsted archipelago, but it was the furthest from the city of Generosity, Bayam. It took nearly 5 hours on a liner to reach it. On the way, Klein bought a suit with local characteristics and a small suitcase to replace the clothes he changed out of, for a total of 14 soldi. They weren't even worth £1. It's really cheap. It's just change compared to a complete suit. Wearing pantaloons, a thick brown jacket, and a light brown cap, Klein disembarked from the liner with a native face that didn't stand out, and he entered some of the old ports on Simim Island. He had spent time buying clothes and changing his appearance, causing him to miss the 9 o'clock ferry and be put in a situation where he could only take the ferry at 10. Thinking of the expenses he had to pay for this acting, he couldn't help but calculate his current financial situation. The faceless characteristic was sold for £3,825. The pirate bounties net me £3,000. Although I haven't received the £6,825, I can basically include it into my budget as long as Mr. Hanged Man doesn't get exposed. The leftover cash from Donna and Company's gratuity add up to £255 in bits and pieces. I found £26, 11 solely, and 8 pence from Steele Mavetti's body. Yes, there's still the 5 gold coins as reserves. I haven't spent much money recently, only spending slightly more than £1 in total. This is something to be happy about. With that, I'll have £7,110. Moreover, I still have the Nightmare Bay under characteristic and the Murloc's bladder. They're still worth something. On second thought, I earned a £3,000 bounty with a zombie Bay under characteristic. The latter is worth about £3,000 to £5,000. That is to say, I earned about £7,000. This is only from Steele Mavetti, Blood Brambles Hendry and Squall. Besides, there was quite a lot of waste. Indeed, hunting pirates is quite a good job. It can administer justice, punish the evil, protect the weak and innocent, and also make me rich overnight. Klein subconsciously turned his head to the side, only to see that the color of the seawater was much clearer than that of Bayam's. It was as if the seawater was a huge, green, sparkling gem, reflecting golden rays under the sunlight. Sure enough, it's not without reason that generations after generations of adventurers have gone out to sea to search for wealth. Even if I deduct the remnant spirituality of ancient wraiths, eyes from a 6-winged gargoyle, spring water from Sonia Island's golden spring, and other supplementary ingredients of a nimble right master, the money I have left will be enough to allow me to buy a decent manor here, in Daisy Bay, in the southern continent's colonies, and in the non-metropolitan areas. Lone's countryside is said to be very beautiful, and if it turns out that I'm really unable to return, I can consider settling down in a similar place. Yes, I still have a 10% stake in the Backland Bike Company, and my future returns won't be low. With confidence, Klein straightened his back and thought about the future. After letting his thoughts wander, Klein began to think about the more realistic question, which was whether he should sell the Nightmare Bay under characteristic, find an opportunity to return it to the Church of Evernight, or create a mystical item with it through an artisan. It depends on the situation. The ideal solution would be to sell it to the church. The martyr, Klein, who had taken 2 potions from the Nighthawks, thought with uncertainty. At the same time, he hoped that little son would soon reach Sequence 7 and be qualified to gain clearance to the methods used to remove the mental corruption from a Beyonder characteristic. As for the matter of releasing the Priest of Light from the glove, he wasn't in a hurry. Little son had just received the potion formula for Sequence 7, so he had no need for it at the moment. He would have to wait for a long time, and the powers of a Priest of Light was very effective in dealing with a pirate like Admiral of Blood in a way that was far more potent than the sun brooch. As his thoughts slowly settled down, Klein entered the small port town. The place was basically filled with natives. Their skin was nearly bronze, and their black hair had slight, natural curls. Their bodies emitted a scent that was derived from prolonged contact with spices. After changing his appearance and asking about Rain's situation, and if there was any news of Went's death, Klein found a secluded corner. He wiped his face with his hand, turning his face into a tall, thin Went with rather distinct facial features. He carried his suitcase and circled around the town to its border. It was then that he saw the winery run by Rain's family. The girl with flaxen-colored hair could no longer be called a young girl. She had obviously matured a lot compared to what Went remembered. She was sweeping the entrance, and there was no one around. Phew! Klein took a deep breath and slowly let it out, feeling as though he was placed in a very difficult position. As a powerful keyboard warrior, he knew about theories like method acting and experimental acting, but he lacked further understanding. He could only try to guess at Went's mood and performance in this kind of scenario. Finally, he closed his eyes and walked over. Rain looked up when she heard footsteps, finally identifying the visitor. She opened her mouth slightly and let out a half-surprised exclamation before saying with a straight face, "Why are you suddenly back? Remember, you're just acting." Klein revealed a smile. "I came to bid you farewell." He spoke in a local dialect with a somewhat nondescript Bayam accent. The language of the Rorsted archipelago was also derived from ancient Fasak and belonged to another variant. As a half-historian, Klein was able to master it easily, and it only took him a short time to master it. "Farewell?" Rain asked, slightly surprised. Klein turned his head, looked to the side, and smiled. "I'm going to chase after a treasure trove, and I don't know when I'll be able to come back. When the time comes, I'll appear with a great deal of money. I'll buy a manor in the suburbs, plant some rubber trees, set up a vineyard, have my own mill, wine cellar, blacksmith shop, and let the air be filled with the scent of all kinds of spices. Then I'll buy a few slaves and hire some servants just like those masters. But I'll still be short of one thing." He overcame his goosebumps that were about to form on his skin, and he turned to look Rain in the eye. "I still lack a wife and a mistress for the manor. Rain, I like you. I wish to marry you. The reason I said it out loud today isn't to get an answer, but because I'm afraid that I would never have the chance to tell you again." After listening quietly, Rain suddenly scolded angrily, "You're a coward." "Ah, this reaction isn't right." Klein deliberately revealed a surprised expression. Rain suppressed her voice and said, 3 years ago, 3 freaking years ago, I was already prepared to head to Bayam with you. Yet you didn't say anything in the end. You coward. You chicken, what's the use of telling me now? You're going to see soon, and you may never come back." The more she spoke, the more agitated she became. "You've said it out loud and become happy. You have no regrets, but what about me? I'll have to constantly think about you returning and live on in pain. You selfish bastard." She waved the broom in her hand and swung it towards Went. Klein knew that the real Went would have hit the broom away, hug the girl, and tell her that he wasn't going out to sea again, but he couldn't do the same. He had to pretend to be chased away pathetically, running all the way to a nearby alley. There he hit his head against the wall while silently cursing himself. It was too f***ing awkward. This is too f***ing awkward. Rain went back to the door, picked up a broom, and crouched down. Her face was ashen. It was unknown what she was thinking about vaguely. She heard a sound and she fell asleep. After using the charm, Klein turned around and nudged Rain, who was sitting on the ground while leaning against the wall. Then he quickly left the area, hiding in the distance to peep at the results. Rain quickly woke up and realized that she had fallen asleep without knowing it. Everything that had happened just now appeared like a dream. She remained sitting there, motionless for quite a while. Suddenly she lowered her head and let out a sharp curse that seemed to come from the depths of her throat. "Went, you selfish bastard." Sigh. Klein, who felt a tiny sensation of digesting his potion, sighed, changed his appearance, and left the place. He would have to spend the night on Saimim Island, as there were no liners headed for Bayam until the morning. 532 Lord Caucasian. After changing his face and turning into one of the two main streets, Klein went straight to the green mailbox and took out a letter he had prepared long ago from his pocket. This was a death notice he had forged as an imitation of an official police document. It was sent to the sergeant of the town of Saimim Harbor. It was about the sudden death of the local resident, Went, in Bayam. When deciding to do the acting, Klein had worked out a plan to keep things on track and not cause irreparable damage to the girl, Rain. His plan was to use the slumber charm to camouflage the real acting as a dream. This way, if Rain had no love for Went, he expected her to directly reject his confession. After hearing about the other party's death, she wouldn't feel any guilt, and at most some fear. In response to this, she could effectively be placated by going to church to pray and confess. If Rain also liked Went and responded to the confession, Then the dream would give Klein a chance to extricate himself from the situation. The notification of Went's death would kill Rain's expectations, and it wouldn't have too negative an impact on her future life. But even so, it's still a bit cruel. No matter what kind of woman she is, facing the situation of a guy confessing to her in her dreams after his death is definitely going to be heartbreaking. She wouldn't be able to recover for a long time. Well, if I didn't do anything, and when the news of Went's death reaches her, Rain would definitely feel very sad even if it might not be that serious. However, that knot in her heart would never be able to be mended, and she would be stuck wondering for the rest of her life whether Went had gone out on an adventure to pursue his and her future, or if he simply didn't like her. It's not a bad way to end things like this. Once she has overcome her pain, she will carry that gentleness of having been truly loved once while leading her future life. Sigh. Regardless, to forcibly interfere in the lives of others for acting, having an impact on an innocent person's life to a certain degree even though I'm using the excuse of fulfilling a wish, it's not a truly kind thing to do. Just like Roselle said, the further one proceeds in the Beyonder pathway, the more twisted and evil it feels. The acting method might not be a catalyst. All I can do is try my best to minimize such effects. After sending the letter, Klein exhaled, and with a native face that didn't stand out, he walked to the only inn in town. Along the way, he summed up his previous experience, which was that disguising yourself as someone else and obtaining feedback was likely a main clause of the faceless principles. Second only to, you can disguise yourself into anyone, but you are ultimately yourself. If it were any other faceless, they would have blocked out information about Went's death for the sake of this role. They would have agreed to Rain's confession and spent 1 to 2 years in a relationship with her, marry her, and have children with her, and then, to not be bound by the various relationships in this identity, remember who they were and leave coldly. If there was no exposure during this process, the potion would mostly be digested. But I really can't do it. It's just completely against my conscience. I can only try to push the envelope. Klein sighed, inexplicably afraid. He shook his head and thought in a silent, self-deprecating manner. Beyonders not only have to constantly fight against threats and madness, but also fight against all kinds of evil thoughts, as well as the corruption that pulls one down and can cause one to fall if they aren't careful. Even so, at the end of the day, one might still be corrupted by the abyss, becoming a monster that one swears to get rid of. Sigh. Suppressing his thoughts, Klein stepped into the inn and said to the boss behind the counter, "An ordinary room." The thin boss looked up and gave a glance, saying, "A valid ID certificate. How can a face I just came up with have one?" Klein smiled in embarrassment. "I forgot to bring it." "Then you cannot stay here. This is the rule of our town." The boss once again lowered his head and calculated his income and expenditure for the day. Klein took out a solely note and pushed it over as if nothing had happened. The boss's eyes suddenly widened. "No, no, put it away. I don't want to be locked up by the sergeant. Get out, you dirty bastard with no proof of identity." Klein was thrown out of the inn in shock, unable to believe that the omnipotent entity known as money had just lost its power. After a few seconds of silence, he turned into an empty alleyway, turning back into J.M. and Sparrow with stark facial features. Klein returned to the inn, tapped on the counter, and said Lonese in a Backland accent, "A room." The boss looked up and immediately put down the things in his hand. He then stood up and nodded with a smile. Okay. Do you need a room with a view of the sea or something quieter?" He switched to a clumsy Lonese that had a thick accent that resembled that of the land of spices, with no further mention of identification. This really is a pragmatic world. Klein silently lampooned and politely responded, "Quiet, yes." Immediately, the boss responded hurriedly. Then he called an attendant, took the keys, and led Klein personally to the second floor. "Sir, how many days will you be staying?" It's one solely 5 pence a night. Just tonight, Klein couldn't stand the enthusiasm, so he answered succinctly. At the Wind of Azure Inn, his luxurious suite with Danitz was 5 solely a night without a doubt. The room the boss had chosen was clean and tidy, and there was no trace of the usual humidity in a harbor inn. Klein looked around and nodded in satisfaction. Excellent. It's my honor, the boss flattered with obvious fear. Klein put down his luggage, rested for a while, then he got up and went back down to the ground floor to settle his dinner. Beside the counter, tables were arranged messily on the first floor. There was a greasy layer on their surface, and a fireplace was burning in the corner, giving off light and heat. The Rorsted archipelago was slightly to the south, and the lowest temperatures in winter was only about 10 degrees C. However, for the locals, this was still cold enough that they needed a fire to warm them up. Klein randomly found a seat and sat down, ordering a local specialty of grilled meat and spiced mushroom soup, with the main dish being potato bread. While he was waiting, he swept his gaze over the customers inside the restaurant. His gaze then instinctively landed on a lady. This lady had a head of simple tied-up black hair and a pair of distinctive greenish-gray eyes. Her appearance was the type that one would never get sick of easily, and the more he looked at her, the more intrigued he became. She was obviously not a native, but she was wearing a man's shirt and a thick tan jacket. By her hand was a round-brimmed hat with a depression in the middle. This was one of the more common adventurer outfits out in the sea. At her table, the 3 other men were the same, and they clearly appeared to have been exposed to the elements. Klein had never hid his appreciation of beautiful ladies, but his attention wasn't drawn to her by her appearance. The sea had a strong sense of discrimination against females. Women who could achieve a certain status among adventurers and pirates were either very scheming, very powerful, or both. They were people that one needed to be cautious and wary about. Their boots have some fresh mud on them. Did they just come back from the forest? Heh heh, they really are adventurers. Klein made a preliminary judgment based on some clues. If these 4 adventurers came by ferry from Bayam, even if they had previously stepped on sewage or mud, the traces would have already dried up. Furthermore, as the town hadn't rained in the past 2 days overall, the roads were quite clean with only some dust, eliminating the 2 possibilities. It could only be explained that they had returned from a trip to the woods on the outskirts of the town. Klein had heard that many adventurers went deep into the primitive forests of the colonial islands in search of abandoned, forgotten pagan temples or altars, which often contained gold and jewels of ancient worship, but were later buried for various reasons in a place that no one knew of. In the bars of the islands, there was no shortage of legends that someone had managed to make a fortune overnight on an adventure into the woods. There might be evil spirits lingering in those places. It would be better to hunt pirates, or for one to at least acquire the relevant information in advance. Klein retracted his eyes and concentrated on waiting for the food. The 7 churches classified the various gods believed by the colony's primitive faiths as evil spirits, but Klein believed that some of them were natural spirits. After a while, the specialty grilled meat was served. It had been sliced into many smaller pieces and strung onto a wooden stick. The surface was smeared with a reddish-brown sauce. The fragrance was rich and the color was alluring. It looks a little like the kebabs from my previous life. In Lone, they're usually roasted as huge chunks of meat. Only after the meat is roasted would the chef slice up the meat. The method used here makes the flavors infuse the meat better. Klein picked up the wooden stick and bit down on a piece of meat. He felt the meat's juice slightly overflow, and there was a hint of sweetness in the salty fragrance. It's my type, he nodded in satisfaction. Klein enjoyed the meal and even tasted the local Gurney sap, a special beverage like lemonade with sugar and milk. He went back to his room. Because he had been hunting the night before, he hadn't slept at all. He washed up early, put out the fireplace, and got into bed. Sleeping too early meant one problem: he would wake up in the middle of the night to pee. Klein's dream was interrupted. He opened his eyes and slowly accumulated the courage to lift his quilt. In the middle of the night, Simim was about 8-9 degrees C, and it was enough to make it feel sufficiently cold. After lying still for a while, Klein stretched out his arm and silently withdrew it. He contemplated for a few seconds before reaching out his hand again and picking up the sun brooch from his bedside table. Although it only provided the feeling of a hot summer on a spiritual level, and it didn't produce any actual heat, it could at least deceive himself into thinking that it wasn't cold. Klein got out of bed and headed for the washroom. He narrowed his eyes to ease the pressure on his lower abdomen. When he was done, he pulled up his pants and was about to wash his hands when his spiritual perception was triggered. Klein frowned slightly and looked up at the vent in the bathroom. Suddenly, something black and slippery dropped and hung there. It was a venomous snake extending its forked tongue. Klein was startled. He opened his mouth and shouted, "Bang!" The snake was miserably hit, and it split in half. What happened? Klein stared at it for a few seconds. Seeing no further movement, he walked out of the bathroom and pulled a gold coin from his pocket. 533 Mr. 4,200 pounds. There is danger in the inn. Klein softly chanted the divination statement, entered cogitation, and then flipped a gold coin. Clang! A faint but crisp sound echoed in the quiet room. The gold coin tumbled and fell, landing in Klein's palm. It was tails, indicating a negative response. No danger. With a frown, Klein looked around and pulled out a bottle of insect-repelling essential oil from his coat on the coat rack. He sprinkled a circle around him. Then he quickly took 4 steps counterclockwise, entering the gray fog to make a divination for confirmation. In about 10 seconds, he received a revelation: there was still no danger. Returning to the real world, Klein shook his head, put the gold coin and bottle back, wore his coat, trousers, and boots before sitting at the edge of his bed, leaning back against the pillow as he placed great caution on this turn of events. He still remembered his seer principles, especially the one about divination is not all-powerful. So even if the answers he received indicated it was safe, he didn't dare to relax and return to his slumber. This isn't to say that he didn't believe in the gray fog's ability to shield him from interference, but rather that there were too many possibilities. His divination statement might not be accurate enough to cover them all, resulting in his misinterpretation. He already had a guess about what had just happened. It was that the 4 adventurers in the restaurant had indeed found the abandoned and forgotten ancient temple in the primitive forest on Simim Island. They had obtained wealth or cultural relics, but they had also stirred the barely surviving evil spirits, causing them to be plagued by evil thoughts and curses. Time ticked by, and Klein suddenly felt a subtle spirituality fluctuation spread out from the room and quickly blend into the surrounding darkness. The hidden flow that he had barely sensed vanished, and the tranquility of the night returned. As expected, it's a result of Beyonder powers. It was solved just like that. I'll just wait a little longer. It would be dawn in an hour or 2 anyway. Even if there really is a problem, this place has a cathedral and a mandated Punisher's team. Klein half closed his eyes and began to engage in cogitation. Bayam, Amyris Leaf Bar. Danitz, determined to hoodwink any monitoring, carried a cup of Lanty proof and drunkenly watched as the girls on the boxing ring danced a hot, sexy dance. Dogshit. It's been so long since they've lost a single piece of clothing. He shouted with the other drunks. Then, ignoring whether they received any response, they laughed out loud, clinked glasses, and drank. Have you read the newspapers? A man who was fooling around in the bar late at night burped and said to his companions, "Did your brain get eaten by a donkey? Do you think that I can read those twisting and turning letters of the alphabet? Holy Lord of storms, I'm only interested in this kind of twisting and turning. Ha ha ha. His companion raised his glass and pointed at the dancers, laughing at what he thought was a humorous answer. The man who had spoken earlier smacked the back of his head. Steele is dead. He was killed by blazing. The nearby Danitz was stunned for a moment. Then he sat up, turning his head slightly. He cleared his throat and took a sip of the liquor, acting as if nothing had happened, but he secretly inched closer to hear what the others had to say about the matter. The adventurer and part-time pirate who had brought him into the trade had once said that life at sea would have been meaningless without liquor, women, and boasting. Steele. What steel? Let me tell you, when I was young, I once defeated a steel pipe. Another drunkard interrupted. What did you do to the steel pipe? Should I say something like, whoa, yours sure is thin? The first man to speak revealed a knowing smile. He didn't wait for a reply as he continued. Steele Moretti is dead. The second mate of Admiral of Blood is dead. The last half of his words came out in a low growl. It frightened one of the fellows who was already wavering to slip to the bottom of the table as he raved in horror. It wasn't me. I didn't do it. Dog shit. A bar is always so chaotic. Hurry up and get to the point. I'm waiting for you to praise Lord Blazing. The disguised Danitz couldn't wait to smash the cup of alcohol in his hand at the group. The papers mentioned that it was jointly done by the Navy and the Church. Steele is dead, Blood Brambles is dead, even Calm Squall is dead. John Smith and that bunch of assholes have been caught as well. A drunk who was still a little lucid came over and joined in on the conversation. No, 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 that's not the truth. The man who raised the topic first shook his head with a smile. I have a friend working at the news agency. He told me that he has verifiable intel that cannot be published. The Navy and the Church were only used. The true murderer is Blazing Danitz and a mysterious, experienced, and powerful adventurer, a bounty hunter. Impossible. There's absolutely no way Blazing Danitz can defeat Steele. Even if it's a sneak attack, there's no way he can finish Steele. A few drinkers shared similar viewpoints. The crux is that powerful adventurer. I suspect he's an adventurer nearing the rank of a pirate admiral. The man who had started the conversation emphasized. I've no idea how Danitz got to know that guy. He contributed in the matter. Apparently Blood Brambles was finished off by him. Didn't you notice? Blazing's bounty has increased to 4,200 pounds. That's right, really. Blazing sure isn't simple. What a fierce pirate, no, a great pirate. Great pirates. I really couldn't tell the last time I drank with him. Pewee. You son of a bitch, when did I ever drink with you? I don't even know you. Amidst the exclamations, Danitz thought in delight. 4,200 pounds. If those fellows were to know, they would definitely get up at night to wipe the deck in envy. Ha ha ha, I can now be said to be the strongest bosun on the Golden Dream. At this moment, Danitz wished he could fly back to the ship and drink and brag with fellows like Iron Skin and Barrel, telling them all about the thrilling events in Banzai Harbor, how he had defeated the fallen bishop, how he had cleverly escaped from the ambush of Steele and the others, how he had set up a trap to finish off all his enemies, and how he would never be able to play the card game of life ever again. Unfortunately, for the sake of Captain, I still have to continue to be the servant of J.M. and Sparrow, that madman. I'm already a great 4,200-pound pirate. Danitz sighed, allowing himself to continue to be paralyzed by the alcohol. As the Storm Cathedral's bells rang, the orange sun rose in the sky. The surroundings were still so quiet that only the sound of water could be heard. Without encountering anything abnormal, Klein exhaled in relief and took off his clothes, returned to bed, and made up for his lack of sleep by sleeping for another 2 more hours. His considerable spirituality allowed him to wake up at the scheduled time of 8:30 a.m. He washed up slowly, changed his clothes, and went to the first floor to buy a loaf of bread with cooked chestnuts and a glass of Gurney sap. He ate as he walked to the dock. Since he had already bought his return tickets for the 9 o'clock liner, Klein kept watch of the time and prepared to board the ship. At that moment, he saw the lady with the greenish-gray eyes, as well as the 3 male adventurers from her team. They were buying tickets at the ticket office. The liner is about to leave. They definitely wouldn't be able to make it in time for the 9 o'clock trip. I wonder what they obtained from the abandoned temple, but last night they attracted an existence similar to an evil spirit. Please don't let anything unexpected happen when they ride on the liner. Klein used his body to block the adventurer's line of sight, took out a gold coin, and made a divination. His revelation was that the later liner wouldn't be in danger. Klein hesitated for 2 seconds, looked at the passengers waiting for the 10 o'clock liner near the ticket office, rubbed his fingers together in silence, and lit the ticket in his palm. He went back to the ticket office as if nothing had happened and bought the 10 o'clock liner ticket for 4 solely. Then, he went to the washroom at the docks, went above the gray fog, and quickly divined his worries. He knew very well that if the results showed that there were great dangers, he wouldn't take the risk of boarding the ship. Instead, he would find a way to prevent the ship from sailing and destroy it, if necessary, to prevent any innocents from dying. If the revelation was the same as the divination from before, he would ride it normally while keeping a lookout for any accidents. In the end, he still received a negative answer. Klein was relieved and returned to the real world. He adjusted the position of the Murloc's bladder for quick access. If an accident really happened, this Bayonder ingredient would become quite important in the vast ocean. This Bayonder ingredient could also be used in a rudimentary, simple manner, just like the all-black eye which had been contaminated by the true creator. 10 o'clock sharp. Klein, in his jam and sparrow appearance, picked up his suitcase, followed the adventurers, and boarded the liner. Along the way, he appeared to doze off or read old newspapers and magazines on the ship, but in actual fact, he was keeping an eye on the greenish-gray-eyed lady and her companions. This wariness continued all the way to the port of Bayam, but no accidents occurred in the middle. Did they resolve all the problems? What did they actually get? Klein stopped by the side of the road, bought the latest newspaper from a newsboy, and watched the 4 adventurers from the corner of his eye until they disappeared. Phew. Klein decided to not think about it anymore. As long as it didn't endanger the overall situation, he wasn't concerned about what those people had done. He was just a little curious. He picked up his suitcase, leafing through the papers as he walked down Acid Lemon Street like an ordinary passerby. Suddenly, with a chuckle, he said to himself, "The bounty for Danitz has risen to £4,200. If things continued like this, he suspected whether he could resist the urge of sending the fellow to the Governor-General's office. Walking back to the Wind of Azure Inn, Klein heard undulated snores that were slowly reaching a crescendo before he even took out his keys. He didn't escape. Klein was slightly surprised, but he wasn't too surprised either. He had previously tampered with Shadow Cloak, so as long as Danitz left, he could use divination methods to track him down and find the Vice Admiral Iceberg. Although he's timid, he's still cautious. Klein opened the door and entered, looking at Danitz, who awoke with a start. He grinned a little. "Congratulations, Mr. £4,200. Danitz was instantly wide awake, wanting to laugh dryly in response, but he couldn't. At this moment, he felt that his life might be in danger. 534, a dream lesson. Danitz's worries didn't come true. Klein gave him a look and went into the bedroom to rest during the 5 hours he spent on the liner. He had always been in a highly tense state. He had also been alarmed last night and didn't sleep well as a result at this moment. He couldn't help but feel exhausted. With a thud, Klein closed the bedroom door. Phew, he scared me to death. Danitz relaxed and slumped into the reclining chair. The scene of him turning into gold pounds had surfaced in his mind a moment ago. He found it difficult to stop having these scenes appear one after another in his mind. After a moment of silence, Danitz, who had been hanging around the bar until dawn, fell asleep again without realizing it. He dreamed that the captain had arrived to save him, but she had failed. Instead, she got caught by J.M. and Sparrow and ended up becoming a maidservant for this crazy adventurer. Just as Danitz was outraged and unable to resist, he suddenly saw the blurry scene around him turn clear just as he was about to wake up. The scene froze on the luxurious suite of the Wind of Azure Inn. Knock, knock, knock. Danitz heard a slow, soothing knock on the door. Wasn't I dreaming? With this question in mind, Danitz walked over to the door and turned the handle. As the crack in the door widened, he saw a familiar figure. She was a beautiful lady, with a face shaped like a goose egg, a high nose bridge, thin lips, and a pair of pale blue eyes that resembled clear spring water. Her long brown hair parted in the middle, tied in a simple but delicate knot at the back of her head as they flowed down. She didn't wear a hat, only wearing a beige coat which was tight at the waist. Her collar was covered with palm-sized flowers woven from white lace. Matching her coat was a dark-colored skirt which reached her knees. The pleats of her skirt were connected. Looking slightly fluffy on her feet were a pair of leather boots that shared the same color as her hair. "Captain!" Danitz cried out in alarm. He hurriedly snapped out of his reverie, turned around and faced J.M. and Sparrow's bedroom while taking a defensive stance. "Be careful. Run. A lunatic is looking for you. He has a terrifying organization backing him." As the feeling of self-sacrifice welled up in him, Danitz heard his captain calmly say, "This is a dream." Dream. "Yeah, I'm dreaming. What's there to be afraid of?" Danitz glanced left and right, folded his arms, turned around and said, "Captain, you simulated the powers of a nightmare. That can't be right. You were near Sanya Island just last week." The largest island in this region of the Sanya Sea, which was also the origin of its name. It was almost like a small continent originally. It was the only remaining gathering place for the elves after the cataclysm. But as time passed, this ancient Beyonder race was plagued by all sorts of factors and gradually died out. The occasional sighting of them proved that they hadn't completely gone extinct at the end of the Fourth Epoch. The Lone Kingdom occupied this island. But in the 20-Year War, they suffered a terrible defeat, handing over Sanya Island to the Fasak Empire. That was already more than 7 centuries ago. Sanya Island was situated northwest of the Rorstad archipelago, and it took nearly half a month by ship to arrive there. Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina Edwards was still in the vicinity of Sanya Island last week, so it was impossible to reach Bayam within a week, unless she could fly or use the spirit world to travel. The beautiful lady whom Danitz addressed as Captain nodded. "We have just entered the Rorstad Seas, still 1,000 nautical miles away from Bayam. In other words, she'll take another 3 to 4 days before arriving. That's what I call normal," Danitz curiously asked. "This should have already surpassed the range of a nightmare. Moreover, it far exceeds," he added inwardly. Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina entered the room and walked towards the table and chair. "It's not a nightmare power, but a secret ritualistic magic. It uses an item left behind on the ship to enter the dream of someone very far away." Listening to the captain's meticulous explanation, Danitz instantly felt as if he had returned to the golden dream and was beginning his lesson. "I've never heard of such ritualistic magic before." "Yes, Captain has mastered many strange and rare magic and witchcraft. No one can tell how much knowledge she possesses. She seems to have mentioned that her sequence name is Mysticism Magister. If I had known that she had this secret technique, then I wouldn't have been so frustrated over how to inform her about the unexpected events in Bayam." Danitz interrupted Edwina's description with a flurry of thoughts. "Captain, you sense that there's a problem with our point of contact over here." "Yes, this is another secret technique. Edwina seemed inclined to describe the specific method in detail. Seeing this, Danitz hurriedly sighed. Poor old Rin and the others. Edwina stopped walking and turned her back to the window, asking succinctly, "What happened?" "I have to start from Daimler Harbor." Danitz felt energized, as if his long-lasting depression had finally paid off at that moment. He described his attempts to recruit J.M. and Sparrow, but he ended up discovering that he was a madman, and he also exaggerated his plight on the white agate. According to the rough draft he had prepared last night, he thoroughly described the weird and horrifying situation at Banzi Harbor, including the ambush and assassination attempt involving Steele Moretti. He explained everything about how he joined forces with J.M. and Sparrow for a counterattack and hunt, as well as his own theories about J.M. and Sparrow's background and powers. This included creeping hunger and the secretive, powerful organization. During this process, he tried his best to restore the truth, only exaggerating the role he played, raising his status from servant or attendant to an assistant or collaborator. Vice Admiral Edwina listened quietly the entire time without interrupting him. When he was done, she nodded lightly and said, "He has no ill intentions." "Him? J.M. and Sparrow means no harm." Danitz quickly said, "Captain, regardless, he's a dangerous fellow. Are you sure he means no harm?" "I can't be sure," Edwina replied very calmly. "Then why were you?" Danitz took a silent breath, sensing the similarity between his captain and J.M. and Sparrow. They were people who he couldn't engage in a conversation with. Vice Admiral Iceberg, Edwina said with a straight face, "That's just my speculation and judgment." Danitz rubbed his temples with his right hand. "Anyway, he's dangerous. There's a secret organization backing him, and I've no idea about the situation of the organization. Captain, I don't think you should take the risk of communicating with him, even if he claims to have something to ask of you." Edwina thought for a moment before saying, "There's no need to take risks. I can communicate with him through you." Danitz first heaved a sigh of relief before asking both curiously and expectantly, "Captain, how will that work? Or should I say, what do I need to do?" Edwina raised her right hand, revealing a stand and a blackboard in her dream. "I need you to hold a ritual," she said. "It's called a soulfall ritual. It allows my soul to pass through the spirit world and attach itself to your body. I'll be able to converse directly with J.M. and Sparrow. It works on anyone below that of a demigod, with an effective distance of no more than 500 nautical miles. It involves reason and communication, and it belongs to the realm of the god of knowledge and wisdom. You must draw the corresponding symbols and magic labels. In mysticism, the blue star corresponds to the god of knowledge and wisdom. Mercury, brass, lavender, pepper, and mint are needed. Blue star corresponds to Saturday. The time of the blue star is from midnight to 1 on Friday and 11 to 12 noon on Saturday. Edwina explained as she wrote the key points to remember on the blackboard, and Danitz instinctively sat down and assumed a listening posture. As he listened, he suddenly felt at a loss. Why do I need to attend classes even in my dreams? In the bedroom, Klein, who was sleeping, suddenly jolted awake, having vaguely sensed something. He got out of bed and listened for a moment in the living room. Although Danitz was snoring, his breathing was calmer than before. It wasn't too strange, but it was sufficiently unusual for an experienced senior expert in mysticism like Klein, who had been through a lot. He softly walked to the door that separated the bedroom from the living room, reached for the handle, and slowly turned it without a sound. Klein walked out of the bedroom and saw Danitz lying in a reclining chair, fast asleep. Everything around him appeared normal. Klein quietly activated his spirit vision and checked blazing, but he didn't find anything amiss. Whether it was the color of his aura or the changes in his mood, there was nothing abnormal about him, all within a reasonable range. After watching for a while, Klein frowned and took out a silver charm. Dream charm. In the dream, Danitz was learning the soulfall ritual with a bitter expression. He had no doubt that the captain in front of him was genuine. No one can fake such a style and hobby. At that moment, he heard the sound of the lock turning. Subconsciously, Danitz looked towards the bedroom where the crack in the door was widening and J.M. Sparrow, who was wearing only a white shirt, walked out expressionlessly. How did you appear here?" Danitz shot to his feet, blurting out in shock. He quickly snapped to his senses and stammered, This is my dream. How is J.M. Sparrow appearing so easily?" With one hand in the pocket of his dark trousers, Klein walked toward the woman who had her back to the window and said in a low voice, "A charm." Then looking directly at the woman, he asked almost with certainty, "Edwina Edwards. Her attire is a little strange. She doesn't look like an adventurer, much less a pirate. She looks like a woman with a decent job, someone who can support herself on her own. The style of her attire looks like it comes from Intis." Klein thought, feeling somewhat unaccustomed. Edwina nodded slightly and similarly replied with a question, "J.M. Sparrow." "Yes, good afternoon, ma'am." Klein smiled slightly, pressed his hand to his chest and bowed. Edwina nodded and replied, "Good afternoon." Klein, who was maintaining his persona, stopped talking, waiting for the other side to take the initiative to ask him about his purpose. He looked at Edwina. Edwina looked at him. There was a sudden silence in the dream for several minutes. From time to time, Danitz looked to the right and to the left, having a baffling feeling that perhaps all of this might really be a dream. 535 Fond of teaching, unable to tolerate the situation, Danitz decided to do something about the situation. He coughed twice and faced Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina Edwards and said, "Captain, Mr. J.M. Sparrow has some questions for you." Phew. Klein let out a sigh of relief. If this stare-down continued, he felt as though his persona would collapse. Edwina gently nodded her head, looked at Klein and said, "Mr. Sparrow, have you received education?" "What kind of question is this?" Klein's expression didn't change as he indifferently replied, "University graduate." "Ah." Danitz looked at J.M. Sparrow in surprise, unable to believe the fact that this crazy adventurer and bounty hunter had actually gone to university and even graduated. He had no way of putting a university, a hallmark of wisdom, with that of J.M. Sparrow together. Unless it's some Hunter University or Killer Academy, or a university that exists only in the fantasies of madmen and psychopaths. Danitz couldn't help but lampoon silently. Edwina didn't seem surprised. She continued to ask, "What languages have you mastered?" Klein resisted the urge to frown and said, "Jotun, Elvish, Dragonese, Ancient Hermes, Ancient Fasak, Lonese." Edwina responded tersely, "Do you understand the other domains in mysticism?" Feeling adrift for a moment, Klein felt like he had returned to his previous life's elementary school days. Due to his age handicap, he had been asked a series of questions by a teacher, such as how many Chinese characters he had mastered, if he had mastered the 4 arithmetic operations, whether he knew the English alphabet, and how many Tang Dynasty poems he could recite. "Calm down. You're J.M. Sparrow now." Klein once again said without emotion, "Adept." Edwina thought for 2 seconds and then explained in an unhurried manner, "I have to combine your standard of knowledge with how I would answer the questions so that you can understand the answers more easily." This. Klein was surprised to find that the beautiful lady in front of him was nothing like an adventurer acting as a part-time pirate. She was basically a teacher with a cold expression, but a kind and patient attitude. He calmed down after thinking about the vampire that headed for the Church of Mother Earth daily. "This is the first pirate admiral I'm officially meeting. She's indeed unique." Klein secretly sighed and said, "First question, where do beyonder creatures appear at sea, the commonly seen ones?" He didn't directly ask about mermaids, as he didn't want her to see through his real purpose, which would lead to unnecessary accidents. Edwina thought for a moment and then wiped the soulful ritual off the blackboard. She then wrote and drew, Set off from Sonia Island, sail 1,200 nautical miles in this direction, and you'll enter the depths of the sea which humans have never explored. There is a Naga tribe active there. They've been working hard to find the underwater city which is rumored to have a powerful demon sealed within. That's the entity of their faith. Edwina spoke in detail, partly from her own efforts to find the treasure itself, and partly from the knowledge and rumors she had exchanged. It took her a while to finish the general story, but to Klein's dismay, there were no mermaids anywhere except in the eastern waters of the Gargas archipelago. He quickly calmed his mood and said, "Second question, do you know how to remove the mental corruption from a Beyonder characteristic?" He didn't hide the fact that he knew about Beyonder characteristics. Edwina's eyes flickered for the first time as though she had a new understanding of Jam and Sparrow. She shook her head. "I don't know. However, I once imagined that it's possible by borrowing the power of an external force and completely crushing the corrupted Beyonder characteristic to reduce it to the smallest specks of light this way. Whether it's corrupted or cursed, they will scatter having lost their vessel. They would rapidly or slowly vanish. As for the shattered Beyonder characteristic, it will gather bit by bit due to their particular traits, eventually taking form again. Unfortunately, only gods can do this. If you get the favor of any god, you can try to please them by offering enough sacrifices and pray for a response. The law of convergence of Beyonder characteristics. In his mind, Klein filled in what Edwina had purposely left out. At the same time, he couldn't help but sigh. This Vice Admiral Iceberg, captain of the Golden Dream, was extremely knowledgeable in mysticism. She wasn't worse than him, someone who had read many of Roselle's diary entries and had experienced many things. It was said that Vice Admiral Iceberg can replicate or simulate the Beyonder powers of her opponents when they use them in front of her. This is rather similar to Mr. Isengard Stanton's 2081 ring. As soon as Klein's thoughts began to wander, he forcefully reined them back, and he nodded as if he was thinking about something. "I agree with this hypothesis. Regretfully, I haven't done it in practice. It's only a conjecture." Edwina rarely used a word that described emotion. Danitz, who had been listening by the side, had a dazed look on his face. He was unable to keep up with the conversation at all. What are they talking about? What are they discussing? Why do I know every word but know nothing when they're strung together? What's a Beyonder characteristic? What does shattering it do? What does it gathering together represent? Danitz looked left and right, his eyes blank. At this point, Klein threw out the third question he had thought about: where can you find ancient wraiths? He only mentioned this kind of monster because the corresponding ingredients could also be used in the domain of death. It didn't expose the secrets of his own sequence. Edwina glanced at Danitz and said, "Hi, keep an eye out for you. If you want to attend Bayham's Beyonder gatherings, he knows a few. He can take you there. Not bad, it's easier to talk to smart people." Klein added, "Do you know where there are people who can make mystical items out of Beyonder ingredients or characteristics?" "I met one at a gathering, but he never showed up again," Edwina answered frankly. "I have grasped the corresponding knowledge. I can simulate it, but I cannot guarantee the success rate." "Heh heh, I'll wait then." Klein didn't harp on the topic and switched to asking, "How much do you know about Death's Key?" "Little." An iron-black key suddenly appeared in Edwina's hand. It was about the size of a lyre, its shape was ancient, and it had a dark luster. The pirate admiral said while half-carrying the item from the shipwreck, "If you mean this key, then I can tell you that it belongs to the giants." Klein glanced sideways at Danitz. "Your bosun told me that it can also belong to a dragon or a demonic wolf. That was the earliest guess. I've recently found some historical documents, and with the help of the other items on the ship, I have a rudimentary idea." Edwina didn't show any agitation. She was filled with patience, but her expression remained cold. After finally regaining his sense as the owner of the dream, Danitz curiously asked, "Captain, is it really the giants?" "Yes." Edwina gave an affirmative answer. That batch of documents showed that there were still many giants active in the fourth epoch. Some of them had switched faiths to the god of combat, while the others were left scattered, becoming the hunting targets of the humans. One of the tribes built a ship and tried to find the lost giant king's court at sea, never to return. The sunken ship we discovered, along with some of the items inside, are very similar to the relics they left behind in their original settlement, so we have sufficient reason to believe that the key belongs to the giants, and it is very likely to be pointed towards the lost giant king's court of their race before the cataclysm. Giant King's Court. Little Son said it's not far from the City of Silver. Klein didn't say a word, but he quietly listened to Vice Admiral Iceberg's description. I have to say, the City of Silver and the Forsaken Land of the Gods are things I know that completely surpasses other Beyonders. Even the seven gods can't find that place, or they find it hard to figure out the exact situation. In this aspect, I'm stronger than them. Klein thought about it with a smug and self-deprecating manner before saying in a deep voice, "If I offer a sufficient price, are you willing to sell the key?" "Of course, unless I acquire additional clues to the Giant King's court." Edwina continued to speak at a moderate pace. "Very good. If the Tarot Club organizes an expedition to the Giant King's court one day, I will buy this key." Klein was about to ask the last question when he suddenly remembered the four adventurers. Relying on the power of the dream charm, he conjured the lady with greenish-gray eyes, who wore a man's shirt, and her three companions. "Do you know them?" Edwina took a glance and said almost without thinking, "Letitia Dolra, an archaeologist and adventurer. Rumor has it that she's a member from the Moses Ascetic Order or the Element Dawn." Moses Ascetic Order. The ancient organization that believes in the hidden sage. It really isn't for money, and their goal is definitely something from the abandoned temple. Klein asked casually, "What do you know about Element Dawn?" This mysterious organization was similar to the psychology alchemists, having been born in the recent 1 to 200 years. It combined the elements of various schools of mysticism. It had its own set of theories, and its members were all proficient in spell casting and had mastery in many ancient witchcraft techniques. Edwina pursed her lips and said, "They've always been fighting against the Moses Ascetic Order. Rumor has it that the eldest daughter of Emperor Roselle, Bernadette Gustave, established it. The Element Dawn is headed by Bernadette. Zaratul's prophecy is quite accurate after all. She can really be considered an important figure in the Beyonder world." Klein sighed inwardly, feeling somewhat enlightened. He resisted the urge to sigh and looked at Edwina. He calmly said, "One last question." When the beautiful lady in blazing Danitz's attention was fully focused on him, he slowly opened his mouth. "Are you interested in cooperating?" "What kind of cooperation?" Edwina returned with a question. The smile on Klein's face became more and more exuberant. With a hint of madness in it, he said, "Hunt Admiral of Blood." Thank you for listening to the story on KevinAudio.com 536 Local Faith. What? Hunt Admiral of Blood? Danitz almost raised his right hand to his ear. His first reaction was that he had misheard. However, Jayaman Sparrow's smile with hidden madness and the slight movement of his captain's eyebrows and abnormality of hers reminded him that what was said had really happened. This madman Jayaman Sparrow really is daring. This is one of the 7 pirate admirals. They aren't people that a character like Steampunk Moretti can be compared with. Danitz's pupils shrank, his heart on the brink of roaring. Putting aside the fact that Admiral of Blood Center's own might, just the pirates underneath him are intimidating enough. His first mate, third mate, and the captains of each ship are all capable of independently leading a large pirate crew. There are still many of the crew which Steampunk Moretti had brought to Bayam with him in the Blood Pirate crew. When Vice Admiral Hurricane Kalangos died silently like a wild dog in Backlund, it was mainly because he wasn't with his pirate crew. However, Admiral of Blood Center is different. He seldom leaves his flagship and rarely leaves the company of his men. Even if the focus is placed back on Senner's strength, it would still be extremely terrifying. He's mysterious, bizarre, and is one of the few powerhouses at the sea who is second only to the Four Kings. Even Captain might not dare to claim to be his superior. A madman's guts really does exceed my imagination. No, he doesn't know the meaning of fear at all. The death and replacement of a pirate admiral will definitely be a great shock to the five seas. One thought after another flashed through Danitz's mind, but in the end, he strangely calmed down. It was because he recalled that J.M. Sparrow was a powerhouse at the level of the seven admirals, and there might be a hidden, terrifying organization backing him. Edwina said after a few seconds of silence, "Do you know of the Rose School of Thought? Not only do I know them, I've also killed their people and taken their mystical items. Wait a minute, why do I have to describe myself as a bad guy?" Klein converged his smile and said in an unperturbed manner, "I've hunted their members." Edwina fell silent again. Next to her, Danitz once again had various thoughts. What are they talking about? What's the Rose School of Thought? Where am I? Whose dream is this? After a short moment of silence, Edwina said, "After the huge battle with Vice Admiral Dusk's pirate crew, Senner's crew vanished. At present, no one knows where they are. One will have to wait patiently." "Is this an agreement?" Klein once again revealed a smile. "I do not lack patience. How can I contact you?" Edwina turned her head to look at Danitz. "He knows how. Me? Soulful ritual. Wait a minute, Captain. You mean I have to follow this madman J.M. Sparrow during this period of time?" "No. Who knows when this fellow will go crazy?" With a start, Danitz quickly opened his mouth and said, "Captain, I've already left the Golden Dream for too long. I've missed too many lessons. I can't wait to return." He tried his hardest to show his sincerity in his eyes, filling them with the desire for knowledge. "I believe we can switch to someone else, like Iron Skin and Barrel." Before he finished his sentence, Edwina suddenly raised her right hand and pressed it against her ear. She looked slightly to the side and said without expression, "What did you say?" "I couldn't hear it. Roselle's dream spell is reaching its limits." The pirate admiral's skirt fluttered slightly as she took a step back before her figure quickly turned faint, reducing into points of fragmented light. The rest of Danitz's words were left stuck in his throat. He stretched out his right hand in an attempt to grasp something, but he ended up weakly drooping down. Roselle's dream spell. The Emperor's presence in the field of mysticism is also quite formidable. The full name of the Vice Admiral Iceberg is Edwina Edwards. Edwards. Isn't this the surname of one of the Emperor's 4 horsemen of the apocalypse? A descendant. However, from the tone of Vice Admiral Iceberg, she isn't familiar with the eldest daughter of the Emperor, Bernadette. They might not even know each other. Klein looked at Danitz, whose expression had completely collapsed, and let out a soft laugh. "Perhaps one day I will call you Mr. 10,000 pounds. Danitz straightened his back in fright. Then he saw J.M. Sparrow's figure disappear from his dream. "If I were only sequence 7 and had a bounty of 7 or 8,000 pounds, then I would be targeted everywhere I go." Danitz stood rooted in his dream, his head hurting the more he thought about it. In the evening, Danitz looked at J.M. Sparrow, who was dressed as a native. "Today, we'll be visiting the location faction. We might be able to find some good things there. Heh heh, they have a great need for Beyonder ingredients, food, and weapons." At this point, Danitz looked J.M. Sparrow up and down. It was rare for him to find something that he was better than him at. He said with a smile, "Their area is filled with local people. There aren't even many people with mixed blood. If there's even the slightest signs of an abnormality in their clothing, you will be discovered. Your pantaloons and brown jacket are fine, but you can't wear a shirt inside. A real native wears Taraba shirts. They're similar to Sea Soul shirts, but they're either all blue or white. They don't wear caps, headscarves, or anything. Also, people like you who look obviously Lonese will encounter very serious discrimination and hostility there, just like a wolf that sneaks into a flock of sheep. You can't hide your existence at all." Before he could finish, he saw Jam and Sparrow tilt his head and look at him. His deep facial features quickly turned soft. His fair skin was instantly stained with the color of bronze. In just a snap, he had become an undeniable native that didn't stand out in any way. After a few seconds of silence, Danitz laughed dryly as if nothing had happened. "Me too. I have to disguise myself." "Your disguise? Heh." Klein took off his cap and sat down. "What local faction? It actually trades Beyonder ingredients, food, and weapons. To put it simply, the resistance." Danitz suddenly wasn't sure if Jam and Sparrow had any connections with the lone officials. Klein was startled for a second. Resistance? Danitz smiled awkwardly and said, "People who clamor for independence and for natives to administer their local affairs. Their encampment is deep in the woods or at sea. They cooperate with many pirates and adventurers. Of course, the ones backing them are mainly people from Fasak and Intis. Often, there will be priests from the god of combat and the eternal blazing sun secretly coming over. Bayam isn't that calm after all." After leaving the kingdom and coming to the sea, Klein finally understood what it meant by an international situation. This wasn't something that could be compared to reading about wars in East Balam from the papers. He nodded slightly and didn't object to visiting the local faction. After leaving the Wind of Azure Inn, Klein followed Danitz, whose face was painted black. They went through the streets, heading all the way southeast, leaving the confines of the City of Generosity. They entered a zone filled with different architectural styles. The buildings here had raised floors, propped up by wooden pilings. There were 3- or 4-story buildings that had evolved from the lone-styled terrace houses. The roads that split from each other were narrow and dirty, with many stalls on either side. They sold all kinds of headgear, earrings, and accessories made of stone. They were mostly bright red or multicolored. What a bunch of strange fellows. They especially like bright colors, just like those venomous snakes in the forest, Danitz whispered. "As someone from Intis, you aren't much better either. You advocate the color of gold and advocate a sense of luxury and exquisiteness, just like a nouveau rich," Klein lampooned. They passed by a group of dark-skinned, skinny, and shriveled natives, entering the alleys which had clothes drying over their heads. The scene before their eyes suddenly opened up, revealing a small municipal square. On the square, a group of locals was gathered around the central pond. Some were kneeling, some were prostrating, some were mumbling, and some were singing softly. They had devout expressions, but they looked numbed. As soon as they realized that someone was approaching, they quickly got up and ran into the surrounding alleys in a flurry. All the windows on the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th floors of the surrounding houses clanged shut, and the square grew quiet. But Klein's spiritual perception told him that there were many people behind the windows, around the alleys, in the dark corners, watching these strangers who had suddenly arrived in their world. Danitz lowered his head and said in a suppressed voice, "Don't worry, this is their way of protecting themselves." "Oh," Klein expressed his doubts. Danitz let out a chuckle. Before this place was completely colonized, the natives on the Rorstad archipelago always believed in sea god Kalvatua. They believed that this deity who appears in the form of a gigantic sea serpent would protect all the islands here, preventing them from being devoured by earthquakes or tsunamis. Now that this belief has been outlawed, the Church of the Lord of Storms has been constantly fighting against the heretics. Even the Church of Evernight and the Church of Steam and Machinery are unable to expand their influence here, and there are only a few cathedrals. But in fact, how can the faith that has been in place for centuries, if not a millennium, be so easily eradicated? There are still plenty of believers of the sea god in Bayam, Blue Mountain Island, and the Rorstad Sea. Even if a bunch of people are captured every 1 to 2 months, a situation in which they suffer all kinds of extreme punishment, It's impossible to reverse this situation anytime soon. The Resistance's main pillar of support are the believers of the sea god. In my opinion, it will take at least another 100 years before the faith of the sea god will be completely eradicated. Of course, that's under the premise that there aren't any other disruptive elements. Sea god Calvatua. Its image is of a gigantic sea serpent. As Klein listened thoughtfully, he followed Danitz into a 4-story house on the right. He went to the top floor via a narrow staircase. Knock, knock, knock. Danitz knocked on the door to his left. "Who is it?" someone asked in a low voice. Danitz replied with a chuckle, "A friend who brings wine and barbecue." "Where from?" the person inside asked a strange question. Danitz stepped back. "At Sea Creek." The door slowly opened and Klein saw a naked arm. The arm was tattooed with a blue, hideous sea serpent. 537 Excessive spiritual perception. Behind the door was a bare-chested man with a hideous blue sea serpent tattooed on his arm and short streaks of red paint painted on the sides of his cheeks, chest, and abdomen. Each group formed out of 3 streaks. Really exotic. However, aren't you afraid of being too conspicuous? Aren't you afraid of being caught by the police while you're outside? You're part of the resistance that engages in secret operations. Klein was about to retract his gaze when he was almost forced to frown by the man's thick, messy eyebrows and cold-blooded eyes. He has killed many people. Klein made a rough judgment based on his spiritual intuition. Honestly speaking, due to his previous life's identity and knowledge, he initially held a lot of sympathy for the rebels under colonial rule. However, after hearing that the man and the followers of the sea god Calvatua basically engaged in the same acts, he became even more wary and repulsed. This wasn't to say that he discriminated against the local faith, but rather, he understood that the traditional faith of all the colonial islands was still in a primitive stage that believed in sacrifice. They worshipped with food and blood, using living sacrifices, and were still in a state of complete ignorance. In addition, with the experiences of the Emperor and myself, the beyonder nature of this world is filled with madness and twistedness. A deity still in the primitive stage of sacrifice is basically unable to resist this trend. It's quite obvious what kind of style they follow. Without a word, Klein followed Danitz into the room. "Edmonton, who's here?" A mild voice sounded from the area near the windows. The tattooed man closed the door and said, "They've disguised themselves." At that moment, Klein had taken a good look at the situation in the room and gained a basic understanding of it. The living room wasn't very large. A cupboard, a table, and a few chairs were enough to make it look cramped. To the right were 2 doors leading to what appeared to be a bedroom. To the left was a kitchen, separated by a cabinet. As for the washroom, there was no doubt that there wasn't one. When Klein went upstairs, he discovered that there was a common washroom at the corner of each flight of stairs. The stench of them not being washed for extended periods of time urged any passers-by to walk up faster. Directly in front of him was a window. 2 bamboo poles hung out and were used to hang a lot of clothes to dry. There were 4 or 5 men sitting or standing in the bedroom's doorway and the living room. All of them were dark-skinned natives with slightly curly hair. They wore dark blue taraba shirts and more or less had red paint on their bare skin, and as for the sea serpent tattoo, Klein couldn't tell if it was there or not because of the clothing. Some of them had revolvers at their waists, some carrying brownish-red hunting rifles. Some even carried gray steel backpacks and long, thick high-pressure steam rifles. They formed a semicircle around Danitz and Klein, who had just entered the room. The person who spoke was a wheelchair-bound man in his 40s. He wore a jacket and had a blanket over his knees. He had a shaved head, a slightly green beard on both sides of his face, and his dark brown eyes were calm and collected. He glanced at his visitor and slowly smiled, blazing. Danitz was stunned for a moment before forcing out a laugh. "Kala, you have a good eye." "Dog shit." Am I so bad at disguising myself? He roared inwardly, unwilling to accept the fact. Callet ignored Blazing's insincere praise and instead chuckled. I heard that you killed Steel and Blood Brambles. How else would they be dead? Danitz retorted without hesitation. Callet narrowed his eyes, slowly shifting his gaze to Klein, who had a featureless face. He knew very well that Blazing Danitz alone would have a hard time killing Blood Brambles Hendry, much less Steel Moretti. His success was rumored to be due to the help of a powerful adventurer, a seasoned bounty hunter. Is it the person beside him? When he looked into Klein's eyes, he didn't see any nervousness, worry, or vigilance. Those eyes were like a deep ocean. It could very well be. At the very least, he's stronger than Blazing. He signaled to Edmonton and the others with his eyes, secretly informing them to be on their guard. What are you doing here? Callet didn't pursue the subject. Danitz subconsciously looked at Klein, and after seeing his nod of affirmation, he replied, "Here to see what good things you have to offer." Callet pointed to a table and said, "It's all placed there." There were many strange and different items laid out, including a whistle made of bone, a simple and crude bagpipe, an iron-black leaf, and a rock stained with blood. Without waiting for Klein and Danitz to examine the items, Callet clapped his hands and said, "I have a mission. If you can complete it, you can freely choose an item from these at no additional cost." He laughed and added, "By the definition of you foreigners, they aren't mystical objects, but they all have some supernatural power, but it will slowly, yes, slowly weaken until it disappears." "What mission?" Klein asked calmly, having no intention of hiding the fact that Danitz was only a follower. He reached into the blanket that extended to his knees and took out a stack of white paper. "Find out where they are. If you can catch them directly, you will get even more." He raised his arms and began to display lifelike portraits, including a lady with greenish-gray eyes dressed in a man's shirt. Letitia Dolra. Klein recognized who the resistance was looking for at a glance. It was the female archaeologist and adventurer he had met last night and had boarded the same ship with this morning. She was suspected to be a member of the Moses Ascetic Order or the Element Dawn. Danitz looked at it closely for 2 seconds and found the picture vaguely familiar. Suddenly, he remembered where he had seen her before. J.M. and Sparrow had shown it in his dreams. He had just asked the captain about it in the afternoon, and were already bumping into something relevant in the evening. Isn't he too resourceful at gathering information? Danitz resisted his urge to glance at the crazy adventurer beside him, afraid that Callet and Edmonton would notice something amiss. He was very experienced in this area. The resistance, who believe in the sea god, are looking for Letitia. The faith of the sea god spreads throughout the Rorsted archipelago, including Simim. There was a snake last night. The image of the sea god is that of a gigantic sea serpent. Klein superimposed the two matters together and quickly came to a preliminary conclusion. Archaeologist Letitia and company had obtained an important item involving the sea god in the forgotten temple in the ancient forest of Simim Island. Hence, it resulted in last night's probing and the Resistance's search. Klein thought for a moment, then he gave a perfunctory reply, "I'll keep an eye out. I won't randomly get myself involved in matters related to evil spirits. Of course, if it's necessary, then I will report it to the officials." He silently added a few words inwardly. Callet nodded and said, "Take a look first and see if there's anything you want." Klein walked over and was just about to inquire as he made his selection when he suddenly sensed something and subconsciously looked towards the right side of the item pile. There was a short sword made of thin bones. It was slightly longer than a forearm and had a milky white body. There were a few dark red deep stripes on it. It can trigger my spiritual perception. Klein stretched out his right hand in an attempt to pick up the sharp bone sword that was placed right at the front, to carefully examine it. The moment his fingers touched the bone sword, Cries of despair and pain suddenly echoed in his mind. A thick stench of blood faintly appeared at the tip of his nose, and he seemed to see many distorted and rotten illusory figures that were covered in mucus. Klein's forehead ached, as though he had been pierced by a needle, and he subconsciously retracted his finger. A little sinister. It's not a simple item. Klein, who had experienced things far more intense before, only showed a slight change in expression. He resisted the urge to activate his spirit vision, afraid that he would see something he shouldn't. Noticing this, Callet exchanged glances with Edmonton and said with a smile, "This bone sword is capable of draining an enemy's blood. It's not bad. Do you want it?" A little proactive. Klein frowned, relaxed his brows immediately, and then he said in a deep voice, "No, there's nothing I want here." If Callet hadn't asked, he was even planning on buying the bone sword and researching it above the gray fog. However, the fact that the man promoted it had left him vigilant. Thus, he rationally abandoned his original plans. Callet crossed his hands and said, "It's not expensive at all, or would you like to look at something else? There's no need." Klein's pupils shrank suddenly as he turned and walked straight towards the door. Danitz hesitated momentarily before hurrying after him. Edmonton, who had a sea serpent tattoo on his arm, watched silently. He seemed as if he would reach out and stop them at any moment, but in the end, he didn't do anything. They were the powerful adventurers who had killed Steele Moretti and Blood Brambles Hendry. Once out of the room, Klein stomped down the stairs without saying a word. Danitz ran after him, alarmed. Based on his take of the situation, he didn't inquire about the situation and only followed. The two quickly returned to the square, and the crowd which had gathered once again to either kneel or prostrate scattered once more. But unlike before, there was a man who had still remained kneeling on the ground, motionless. Klein didn't even glance at him as he walked past without stopping. However, Danitz had taken a subconscious look, only to discover that the man's face was as dry as a weathered rock. "Pa!" A piece of flesh from the man's cheek fell to the ground. It was a piece of grayish skin with facial hair attached to it. He seemed to have lost all the moisture in his body. Danitz was startled and didn't dare to look again, feeling that things had become strange and dangerous at some point. The two of them passed through the alleys, left the city, and boarded a rental carriage. The carriage driver was obviously a native, around 40 years old, and his laughter was very pleasing. But along the way, he didn't say a word. It was so quiet that it made Danitz feel like his heart was beating like a drum. Klein pursed his lips and remained silent. The rental carriage quickly arrived at the dock area. In order to change his attire, Danitz got it to stop a distance from Acid Lemon Street. After getting off the carriage, Klein didn't pay the fare or stop. He immediately took large strides and left, leaving Danitz stunned. He tossed 2 solely to the carriage driver and hurriedly chased after Jam and Sparrow. After a few steps, he looked back and saw the driver kneeling down with a face full of zeal and devoutness. He leaned over the ground and kissed the ground where Klein had stepped. 538 Dispel, what's happening? Danitz couldn't believe what he was seeing. This didn't shock him, but it left him inexplicably terrified. It was like jumping into a bucket filled with ice when drunk, feeling a bone-piercing chill permeate his body from the soles of his feet to his head. What exactly happened? Why did things become so strange? Danitz took a breath, forcing himself to turn his head, and he chased after Jam and Sparrow. He found the crazy adventurer walking faster and faster, to the point where he had to run with small paces to keep up. Crossing the street and through the alley, Danitz suddenly saw a greenish shadow fall from a tree. Pa! Its body was covered in scales as it twisted its slippery body and had a triangular head. It extended its scarlet forked tongue and was none other than a rather long venomous snake. Dog shit. Why would there be snakes in this season? Danitz wasn't afraid of such creatures. He had even roasted snake meat before, but it was the abnormality of everything that left him agitated. Circling around the coiling snake, Danitz subconsciously looked left and right and found that on both sides of the gutter, in the corners of ruined houses, and on the insides of rusty water pipes, there were pairs of cold, vertical, and different-colored eyes looking out. Danitz felt a chill run down his spine, as if his scalp had been pierced by a dense array of fine needles. He didn't dare to stay any longer, nor did he dare to leave. He increased his speed again and followed closely behind Jam and Sparrow. Entering the Wind of Azure Inn, he couldn't help but look up as he walked up the wooden stairs, wanting to ask something. Suddenly, his chest tightened and his breathing stagnated. At that moment, it was as if he had dived into the bottom of the sea, being pressed down by the heavy torrents of water from every direction. Whoosh! Faintly, Danitz heard the rush of the tide and saw a faint, illusory light surround Jam and Sparrow, as if it were forming an endless, bottomless blue ocean. Within that ocean, there was an enormous azure-blue figure holding everything up. It resembled a tower. Danitz's right foot stopped in midair, unable to lower his foot. He wasn't unfamiliar with such feelings. Back at the last pirate convention, the King of the Five Seas, Nast, was even more imposing and terrifying than this. Almost all the pirates couldn't lift their heads, and even powerhouses at the admiral rank could only barely resist. Danitz knew very well that it wasn't a result of Jam and Sparrow's own powers. If he was at the level of a demigod, there was no need to include the mandated punishers during his hunt of Steampunk Moretti. Ocean, tide. These two terms flashed through Danitz's mind, and he immediately thought of the matter of the Resistance's faith in sea god Calvatua. Could it be that Jam and Sparrow suffered the sea god's curse via an unknown process when he touched the bone sword? The devotee's corpse that lost all its moisture is one of the conditions for the curse's activation. When the carriage driver prostrated and kissed the ground, was it because he sensed the sea god's aura? Man, Jam and Sparrow would probably die here today. Should I stay far away to avoid being implicated? At the very most, I'll come back to collect his corpse. It might still be possible to save him. I can use the soulfall ritual to seek Captain's help. She knows so many different kinds of odd secret techniques. She should be able to resolve this problem. No, Lord. The soulfall ritual has a requirement of being within 500 nautical miles. They're still en route, and it will take at least half a day to enter that range. As he desperately tried to think of something, Danitz stopped panicking and treaded steadily into the luxurious suite with Jam and Sparrow. Klein still remained silent, but his dark brown eyes seemed to have a rich azure-blue color that was nearing the color of black. He went straight to the bedroom and locked the door behind him. Danitz stood outside, in a dilemma on whether to flee or save the man. Inside the bedroom, Klein closed his eyes, waiting for the right opportunity. Suddenly, he took 4 steps in a counterclockwise manner, chanting a statement with each step. A wave of manic or high-pitched ravings rapidly rang in his ears as his spirit body shot up into the gray fog. Without a sound, he heard an indescribable, shrill, and painful howl. Klein appeared within the ancient palace, at the very end of the long, mottled table. In the motionless gray fog below, an illusory, gigantic azure-blue sea serpent appeared. It was located in an ancient dark ruin coiled around a half-collapsed pillar. Its hideous head was raised, and its bloody mouth was wide open, revealing many curved fangs that were even longer than a human's forearm. On its milky white fangs, there were layers upon layers of flowing blood and mucus. This sea serpent madly swung its tail, setting off terrifying waves and ridiculous ripples, causing the entire ruins to sway, as if it was about to collapse. The scene rapidly shattered and dimmed. Regardless of how the unimaginably large sea serpent struggled, it was unable to turn the situation around. All it could do was let out a long, painful scream in agony, as it was reduced to points of light before disappearing into the gray fog. Klein sat in the high-backed chair belonging to the fool as he quietly watched everything. He didn't make any superfluous actions for a long time. The gray fog silently spread out, and the scene seemed to return to its eternally unchanging state. After nearly a minute, Klein leaned back in his chair, sighed, and said the serpent's name, "See God Calvatua." After coming into contact with the bone sword, he had already felt the abnormality, and during his conversation with Baldy Kalat, he had keenly discovered that a tiny, weak but extremely cold and sinister energy had invaded his body at some point in time and was slowly corrupting his soul. Klein made a prompt decision and turned around to leave. He then sensed that there was a connection between the sinister power and his surroundings. It gradually strengthened and slowly connected to an unknown place. So, as he diverted attention to resist the corruption, he also controlled himself so as to not interact with his surroundings. Klein believed that as long as he responded to the abnormality on his journey back, it would only serve to intensify the corruption, to the point of making irreversible. At first, he wanted to find a nearby washroom and use the gray fog shielding and isolation to remove the cold and sinister power. But after repeated considerations, he decided to leave the area. This was because there were many followers of the sea god around, and it was extremely likely for an accident to happen. During this process, Klein grasped another point, which was that if he dispelled it ahead of time, the power projected by sea god Calvatua would leave remnants in his flesh and blood. The consequences and effects would be unknown. He had no choice but to patiently wait for the opportunity to purify himself by waiting for the cold and sinister energy to thoroughly permeate his spirit. Reflecting on everything that had happened, Klein lightly rapped the edge of the table and muttered to himself, "It's not that strong." The sea god's level was much lower than he had imagined. His original plan was to use the method that had finished off Ammon's avatar to deal with the sea god Calvatua's projection, which was trying to take over his body. However, even before he had even fused with the Dark Emperor card or through his paper angel, Calvatua ended up being dispelled by the gray fog directly, without leaving a single trace. On this basis, Klein concluded that sea god Calvatua's level was inferior to blasphemer Ammon, even though it was possible that the latter was more adept at intrusion. But it had only been an avatar. Was it thrown off its pedestal by the Lord of Storms, or is it not even at the level of an angel? It's just a slightly stronger demigod that can respond to the prayers of its believers within a certain range. Klein recalled and found that sea god Calvatua was in an abnormal state. The foundational existence of this evil spirit is rather weak, as though it can collapse at any moment. Moreover, it felt like it had fused with the spirit world in the ruins it was in, and it's precisely as a result of this that it was able to escape the encirclement of the Church of Storms. Klein leaned back in his chair and made a guess. What happened today is definitely not a coincidence. It stems from archaeologist Letitia's act of taking away some important artifact in the Forgotten Temple. It caused sea god Calvatua's condition to instantly deteriorate when it was already barely surviving. It made it impossible for it to hold on to its existence. As it got its believers to track the item, it also prepared to possess another body for its survival. That bone sword should have originated from its demigod body, and it hides a bit of the power it projects. As long as the target is suitable, it will infiltrate the body of the person who touches it, corrupting the soul and establishing the coordinates. It will then allow its spirit to be transferred over before it dissipates. But clearly, it's not adept in such matters. Yes, it's not the snake of Mercury. It's unable to create a closed loop on itself for reincarnation. It's also not like blasphemer Ammon, who can be a parasite inside a person's soul. To really possess my body, It will directly cause its body to crumble and create a terrifying monster. According to this logical development, the dying Calvatua will likely engage in many crazy actions in the near future. Klein frowned. He didn't hesitate as he plummeted into the fog and returned to the real world. He unlocked the door, opened it, and entered the living room, startling the pacing Danitz. Danitz looked him up and down a few times and asked cautiously and warily, "Are you all right?" Klein maintained J.M. and Sparrow's persona and calmly replied, "It's settled, settled." Danitz looked around before glancing at the bedroom, wondering if he had been hallucinating that there wasn't any sea god curse. What did he do in the bedroom? He was lifted from the curse of the sea god in just a minute or two. Man, this guy has a huge secret. Danitz took 2 steps back and made way. Beside a table covered with a significant number of miscellaneous items, the wheelchair-bound Baldy Callet wore a look of regret as he said to the tattooed man, "What a pity. Just a little more, he didn't pick it up, just touched it." Edmonton sighed as well. Callet looked at the slightly bent bone sword and fervently said to himself, "When an outsider picks up that holy sword, God will walk the land again." Edmonton fell to his knees as well, as though confessing to a deity. As time passed, both Callet and Edmonton suddenly heard 2 miserable shrieks. They looked up and saw that 2 of their companions had collapsed. Their skin was like a weathered rock, having lost all the moisture in their bodies. Callet and Edmonton glanced at each other and felt a peculiar atmosphere. Both of them stood up at the same time and looked at the table. That milky-white holy sword cracked loudly, splintering into countless small pieces. 539 late-night operations. When an outsider picks up that holy sword, God will walk the land again. But what happens if the holy sword shatters? These 2 sentences echoed in the minds of Callet and Edmonton. The matter was completely in the gaps of their knowledge. For a few seconds, they stared at the shattered holy sword, their expressions dull while they remained speechless. They couldn't believe that the holy sword, which had only been touched by an outsider in the evening, had suddenly shattered. What does this mean? What does it represent? The 2 of them didn't dare to think too deeply about it. They felt as if they had returned to the very beginning. Back then, one of the secret bases of the resistance had been discovered by the lone military. They were raided without any warning, and this resulted in their fathers being killed in that massacre. Their female relatives were abducted and sold to different places. Before receiving the grievous news, the feelings Callet and Edmonton felt that day mirrored what they felt today. They felt heavy, confused, expectant, and unease, all of them mixing to form an intense pressure. Return to the forest, find the high priest, and figure out the reason. Perhaps this is the latest revelation from God. Callet turned his wheelchair and said in a deep voice. Edmonton immediately stood up, saying to his remaining subordinates, "Continue searching for those blasphemers, but do not stay here. Also, instruct the believers outside not to hold any rituals or even pray." The unexpected change in events made him extra vigilant. Bam! In the corner of the street where the Cathedral of Waves was located. Holding a stack of white folded paper, Danitz turned his head to the side, feeling a mix of nervousness, worry, and puzzlement. "You mean that I'm to post them in different parts of the street, and finally post it on the main door of the Cathedral of Waves?" He was very afraid that the door of the cathedral would suddenly open, and a group of fist-brandishing priests and bishops would rush out, immediately attacking them without even asking why he had posted the poster. Klein maintained his coldness and said, "Yes." His original plan was to hand the matter of sea god Calvatua over to Mr. Hanged Man, so that he could warn the Church of Storms. However, considering that he still held the secret of Banzi Harbor, and he might even have reported the matter, it would be easy for him to arouse suspicion with another piece of important information in such a short period of time. As for the solution, it was very simple. He could post a few posters on the mandated Punisher's front door so that they could see it as soon as they came out. There was a small problem with Klein's plan. He couldn't tell which of the shops around the Cathedral of Waves was the cover identity of the mandated Punishers. All he could do was make Danitz work a little harder and stick the posters everywhere in prominent spots, including, but not limited to, the front door of the Cathedral of Waves. I should have run away earlier. Why would I think that this fellow had saved my life? Perhaps I would have been converted into gold pounds if he were any other powerful adventurer. No, who would have imagined that this lunatic would so easily resolve the sea god's curse? Fleeing might put me in an even worse state. While lamenting inwardly, Danitz unrolled the pile of white paper and casually glanced at the content. After Letitia Dolra and company entered and left the sea god's ruin in Simeme Island, they were pursued by the resistance. Meanwhile, Kalat and the resistance were trying to sell a strange bone sword that looked a little bent. Sea god Kalvatua's body is on the brink of collapse with an extremely deranged mental state. Danitz froze for 2 seconds, then he subconsciously glanced at Jam and Sparrow. I can understand the first few statements, but why is there a mention of sea god Kalvatua being on the brink of collapse and in an extremely deranged mental state? How does Jam and Sparrow know? Did he discover a problem when he was dealing with the sea god's curse? And how did he deal with the sea god's curse? The organization behind him is more powerful than I thought. Could it be that it's similar to the Aurora Order in which they serve a real deity? The more he thought about it, the more Danitz trembled in fear. The first time he heard of the Aurora Order had originated from a robbery at sea. Back then, it was the first time he saw his captain's serious expression. After that, he was taught some so-called general knowledge of the mysterious world. Klein responded to Danitz with an emotionless gaze. In the poster, he had eliminated any subjective assumptions, and he had only described the matters that could be confirmed with certainty, so as to not interfere with the judgment of the higher-ups in the Church of Storms. Among them, the content regarding an important item that Letitia and company had taken away was excluded. The lost temple was changed to a broader and more inclusive sea god ruin. The base was obviously abandoned by Kalat and the others after realizing that something had happened to the sea god, so it was also left unmentioned. Danitz suddenly retracted his gaze, afraid to look any further. Captain said that the more secrets someone has, the more dangerous they are. He thought for a while and worriedly said, "If we stick it on the front door of the cathedral, it will definitely garner immense attention from the Church of Storms. Will they discover that I was the one who did it?" Klein gave a terse answer. "Yes." Danitz forced a smile and said, "Then wouldn't I be in grave danger?" Klein used his clown ability to control his expression and calmly replied, "You were already a pirate who has a bounty for your head. Do you think you can swagger down the main streets of Bayam now?" Klein lampooned inwardly. "That's true. No matter what, they will still capture me and claim my bounty. No, there's something wrong with that," Danitz blurted out, "but my bounty will increase." Klein looked at him, but he didn't say anything. All he did was grin a little. For a moment, Danitz thought he heard a rhetorical question. Isn't this a good thing? A good thing for a donkey to kick? With a dry chuckle, Danitz took the pile of posters and, taking advantage of the heavy winds and late night, posted them in prominent spot on the street near the Cathedral of Waves. It really looks like posting a small advertisement. Klein, who had one hand in his pocket, observed from afar and commented inwardly. He sighed and thought, "It's good to have an assistant. At least, I don't have to do something that tarnishes my reputation." If I were in Tingen or Backlund, if something like that had happened, the scene was too beautiful to imagine. Danitz finally reached outside the Cathedral of Waves, plastered the poster on the front door, clenched his fist, and pounded on the door. After finishing all of this, he turned around and ran, as if there were 10 mandated punishers running after him from behind. Klein didn't dare to be negligent. He pulled out a paper figurine, shook it off, and burned it to ashes before briskly walking to another street. After his recent encounters with the mandated punishers, he had a deep understanding of their style, and he didn't dare to be the slightest bit careless. It was only when they were far away from the Cathedral of Waves that they slowed down and regained their normal walking speed. Danitz had a good constitution. His face wasn't flushed, nor was he panting. He was slightly puzzled and asked, "Why didn't you just write to the police or throw it in the Governor General's office?" Before Klein could reply, he had already realized why. That's right, the lower-ranking police and the staff of the Governor General's office are locals. They might very well pity the resistance or might be clandestine believers of Sea God. As they were talking, they turned a corner and saw an extremely large red building in front of them. The inside was brightly lit, and music could be heard from within. People and carriages streamed in and out the door. It didn't exude any vibes that it was late at night. We actually ended up walking here. After a second of hesitation, a smile appeared on Danitz's face, a smile that all men understood. Red Theater. Klein, who was rich in theoretical knowledge, suddenly came to a realization. Danitz laughed mischievously. This is one of the most famous places in the entire Sanya Sea. There are mysterious and flirtatious Balam girls, passionate Fainapotter girls, open and alluring Intis maidens, tall and graceful Fasak ladies, conservative and quiet lone women, gentle and docile natives. This fellow knows a lot. He comes often. Klein swept a glance at Blazing and said nothing. For some reason, Danitz felt as though he had been seen through, and he immediately laughed awkwardly. This is what pirates talk about when bragging. I've only been here a few times. I didn't have much money in the past. I could only find some average ones, and it's mainly in the area of the Fog Sea. Afterward, I joined the Golden Dream. No wonder. Although Vice Admiral Iceberg's men receive quite good employment perks and often get to share in the treasure, it's still quite difficult to save up a few houses in Bayam. Compared to the typical pirate, this guy at least knows temperance and saves his money. Klein thought in enlightenment. Danitz didn't wish to continue on the topic as he changed the topic. There are a lot of street girls in Bayam, especially there. He pointed into the distance and said, "There was once a pirate who did an experiment. He randomly knocked on a family's door, produced some money, and requested to do it with the mistress once. In the end, 3 to 4 families out of the 10 agreed. Tusk, if it's someone like you who has the standard lone look, almost no one will refuse you. They might secretly hide their daughters to prevent you from discovering her. Heh heh. Lone's navy would commit many murders and rapes here every year. They aren't any better than the pirates, but they would only be sent back to the country and pay some small fines." Klein listened quietly, and he suddenly thought back to the evening when the believers of the Sea God were praying around the pool. He thought back to their feverish and numb faces. Backlund, within the Odora family's villa. Emlyn White, who had taken the initiative to expose certain problems about himself, nervously followed Cosme underground. He once again arrived in the gray stone hall where the black iron coffin was kept. "Esteemed Lord Nibs, why have you summoned me?" Although Emlyn had rehearsed this scene in his mind dozens of times, he still couldn't completely remove the tension and apprehension in his heart. In this state, he suddenly understood a problem. From the viewpoint of theater studies, the role he was acting as should hide his worries and fears. There's no need for any special concealment. I did well. Emlyn was suddenly much calmer. A deep, aged voice sounded from the coffin that was covered with symbols and magic labels. "To reward you. For the ancestor, you risked your life to pray to the fool. Although you didn't receive a response, you bore an enormous risk. This is an act that needs to be rewarded. Here is an acceptance draft for £7,000, a reward for you. I didn't give it to you in a timely fashion due to the great smog of Backland, but it's never too late. At the same time, you must always be aware of yourself and not relax. If anything abnormal happens, immediately inform Cosme. He really gave me money. Emlyn almost forgot to close his mouth. 540 suppression. Even when Emlyn White left the Odora family's underground region, he still found things surreal. He couldn't believe that he could so easily be rewarded with £7,000. The acceptance draft was light and weightless in his hand, but he felt the absurdity of reality. The hanged man's method was really effective. Instead of exposing me and punishing me, Lord Nibs gave me a generous reward. And this was done solely to feign ignorance while encouraging me to make attempts so that he can observe in secret. Are the thoughts of the sanguine that complicated as well? Emlyn sighed, his mind feeling adrift. Quickly, he stopped his thoughts from wandering and turned his attention back to the reward of £7,000. With this, I can buy that baron's remains from the hanged man and concoct it into a potion. I'll soon become a baron sanguine baron, Lord Emlyn White. Emlyn's eyes lit up as his footsteps turned significantly brisk. Within the sanguine, if one wasn't bestowed the corresponding ritual by the elders, they would remain stuck at the same level they were at during birth. It was almost impossible to rely on time to advance. Unless one was extremely lucky, having an ancestor of the family that was nearing the end of their lifespan, such that they had no choice but to bestow their powers to a descendant through a ritual. Most of Emlyn's sanguine peers would remain stuck in the concept of adulthood. There might not be any chance of them obtaining an aristocratic title for decades. Emlyn's father and mother had lived for years, but they had yet to become barons up this very day. They couldn't even see any hope of becoming one. As Emlyn walked out the door, he couldn't help but glance at the nearby Cosme Odora. This elderly sanguine who has been active in the Roselle era has only been a baron up to this day, and I am about to reach this rank as well. One day, I will become a sanguine marquis like Lord Nibs. No, a duke, or even a prince. Only by doing so will I be able to shoulder the responsibility of being the sanguine's messiah. Yes, the baron's remains is only about £4,000. I'll have a lot of money left. I can even buy a few more dolls and give them some new clothes. Emlyn unconsciously straightened his back and began to walk more and more proudly. In the Berg household in the city of Silver Derrick lit some candles and prepared for the sacrificial ritual. The lightning frequency alternated several times before he finally found an opportunity. He was very sure that the chief wasn't be able to keep an eye on him at this moment, because he had left the city of Silver with the little boy, Jack, who had recovered somewhat, and a group of explorers, in search for the so-called route that led from the coast to the destroyed city. It didn't take long for Derrick to set up everything, and say Mr. Fool's honorific name in a reverent, low voice. He very skillfully and methodically sacrificed the Spirit Eater's stomach pouch needed by Miss Magician, and the Beyonder ingredients designated by Mr. Hanged Man, to the ruler above the gray fog. There were many cracks on the city of Silver's solid city walls, but they were filled to the brim with black hard soil. Strands of dense weeds grew on them, swaying in the wind like human hair. All of a sudden, all of them stood up as if they wanted to capture something, but they turned limp without any strength left in them. Early morning at the Cathedral of Waves. Alger Wilson, who had come to collect the bounty, heard an important piece of news from the diocese bishop, Chogo. Letitia Dolra of the Moses Ascetic Order had disguised herself as an archaeologist and entered the depths of the jungle on Saimim Island. It was unknown what she did that inflicted grievous injuries to see God Calvatua, who had been in hiding for years, pushing it to the verge of collapse. As a result, it was frantically searching for an opportunity to survive. Rumor has it that this evil spirit, which calls itself Sea God, had been discovered by two powerful cardinals of the military a long time ago. After it was defeated by them through the use of a sealed artifact, it could only barely escape and hide. This situation has persisted for more than 100 years. Without any intrinsic changes, why would it suddenly collapse and be unable to maintain its existence? Alger frowned slightly, wondering what the difference was. A situation deliberately created by the Moses ascetic order. But why didn't they do so in the past 100 years? To complement one of their other plans. Between speculation and doubt, Alger suddenly became aware of an important factor. The biggest and most fundamental difference between the last 100 years and now was that the world had come to Bayam. Fool's adorer had come to the Rosted archipelago. Does his appearance anywhere indicate that something big is about to happen or is brewing? Previously, it was the great smog of Backlund, and there was the abnormality in Banzi Harbor. Now, there's the dying struggle of sea god Calvatua and the unknown plot of the Moses ascetic order. No, to be precise, wherever a major problem is brewing or about to happen, Mr. Fool's adorers will be there. They accept Mr. Fool's arrangements and pursue the activities of those secret organizations, the evil gods and angels. As soon as his train of thought changed, Alger was suddenly enlightened, feeling as though he had grasped the truth. It's not that things happen wherever the world is, but that the world and the other adorers will appear when something is about to happen. What good does this bring to Mr. Fool? Is it a plot solely to destroy the enemy's schemes, or does it help him lift his seal and release more power? Alger held back his doubts and decided to seize the opportunity to submit some intel from before. He clenched his right hand into a fist and pressed it against his left breast. He said with a look of hesitation, "Your Excellency, while pursuing the remnant forces of steel, I heard a piece of intel." "What is it?" Chogo had originally planned to send this bishop-pranked captain out into the sea to search for traces of the resistance, but he was forcibly interrupted by him. For a moment, he felt irritated. Alger recalled and said, "Someone mentioned Banzi Harbor in a conversation. They mentioned that an abnormality had happened there, but the descendants of the Medici family were well hidden and didn't end up being discovered." Banzi Harbor, abnormality. Chogo took a step forward and pressed, "What else did they say?" "Other than mentioning that there was a fallen bishop of the church, nothing else." "Your Excellency, is the Medici family a dark family of the fourth epoch?" Alger asked deliberately. Chogo's expression sank. "That's not something you should know. I'll report it to His Eminence Cotman at once." Cotman was a Church of Storms cardinal, the Archbishop of Rorstad Sea, a high-ranking deacon of the mandated punishers and the true ruler of the Bayonder world in the archipelago, John Cotman. Chogo thought for a moment before asking, "Who was the person who mentioned this? What does he look like?" Alger was long prepared. "I don't know them, and they never showed up again. I remember that the person mentioning Banzi Harbor and the Medici family was an ordinary-looking young man with a thin face, a broad forehead, black eyes, and black hair. He wore a monocle. He seemed to notice that I was eavesdropping, but he didn't show any anger. Instead, he smiled at me." Alger had been describing blasphemer Ammon. He wanted the cardinals to believe that the exposure of the secret regarding the Medici family and Banzi Harbor was the result of a struggle between the kings of angels. This is really a suitable person to use as a reason. He wouldn't appear to defend himself, and even if he did, no one would believe it, and clearly any divination regarding him would have zero results. If Bayonder means are used to confirm my information source, there will be strong signs of interference from Mr. Fool, and they won't be able to get an accurate answer. From the looks of it, this is equivalent to what Ammon did. Alger thought with considerable relief. Chogo nodded lightly. "Find these people and trace the whereabouts of the resistance." "Yes, Your Excellency." Alger answered with a look of piety and struck his right fist on his left breast. Dark clouds covered the sky as the rain fell down in torrents, creating white fog in the process. In the port of Bayam, the blue water rose slowly but firmly, and the freighters and liners rocked like leaves fluttering in midair. The rain continued to fall, and the sea level gradually approached the dike. The city was flooded with water in many places, and the environment was greatly suppressed. One by one, the fanatical and numb locals, in their taraba shirts and tattered jackets, came to the edge of the cliff or the dike before jumping into the sea. Their flesh and skin rapidly lost moisture as they fell, and they were already desiccated corpses by the time they fell into the sea. A group of people were rioting as they hugged a Navy sailor who was walking out of a base. They angrily bit him to death with their teeth, reducing him to a mangled, bloody mess, and caused chaos on the streets. Whoosh! Boom! The dike collapsed, and the rising seawater poured into Bayam City. When Klein jolted awake, his mind was filled with the scene from his dream. For a seer, this was a very clear revelation. Sea god Kalvatua has failed to find a way to survive and has completely given up, resulting in it going completely mad. It wanted to create a storm, stir up a tsunami, and drown the Rørsted archipelago so that countless can join it in death. At the same time, its devotees are starting to do extreme acts. I've already informed the Church of Storms. They'll likely be able to stop it. No, even if I didn't inform them, they'll definitely be able to sense a problem with the appearance of such a situation. They would then make the necessary response. Klein rolled to his feet, wore his clothes, and walked out of his bedroom. He saw blazing Danitz standing by the window looking out. He saw the clouds hanging low as rain poured down as though it was endless. A sign has appeared. Klein walked over to Danitz, who was also looking out at the repressive weather. He could faintly hear the abnormal sound of the tide. In the midst of silence, the sound of explosive thunder suddenly rang out in the air. The leaden-colored clouds quickly split apart, and the falling rain lost its source. In the direction of the docks, everything returned to normal. The morning sun shone down from high up in the sky, bathing Bayam in holy light. Danitz hissed and said to himself, "John Cotman changed the weather. John Cotman, the Church of Storms cardinal and high-ranking deacon of the mandated punishers. He suppressed Kalvatua's powers." Klein retracted his gaze while in thought. Danitz heaved a sigh of relief. "I was rather worried just now. Heh, afraid that the sea god who's on the brink of a breakdown would create a disaster. But there's John Cotman." Seeing that Jam and Sparrow was silent, he continued, adding, "At sea, even the king of the 5 seas and Queen Mystic won't be his equal. Captain said he's a sequence 3 demigod. The potion's name is, it's Sea King."